Next is Margaret Archer, asking a heavy question: can human beings and AI robots be friends? Margaret.
Thank you. I haven't got my device. Thank you. I think I understand it. Yep, okay. My apologies to all of you for ruining the coherence of the program through being ill yesterday. I really didn't feel fit to present. Because this is quite an interest, well, it interests me greatly. Why do intelligent but naive people coming to the field of artificial intelligence come with a preformed robophobia? And I think we can lay a lot of the blame to to science fiction, and particularly to the rather evocative science fiction movies. Now, all of these, and much of our discussion so far in this conference, has been on the robophobic side. Can we trust? Should we put our life in their hands, etc., etc.? It's all perfectly obvious. Some of the answers have tried to debunk the phobic element here. But let me just signal one thing that I think is very striking about particularly the films, less the science fiction. There's some excellent volumes. All of these are based upon the robots will take over. Now, one of the difficulties of this is that in order to take over, I don't know one example from the history of domination where the dominant party, whether we go back to the Romans or even much earlier than that, hasn't had one thing in common. They have wanted to take over. And the same goes for colonialism and to come right up to date. Now, to want something is an act of consciousness. To care about it, to be motivated by it, to do it, involves consciousness. And yet these are the self-same people who deny that an AI robot can have consciousness. So we have a big dilemma outside this question. Now, you may have a question in turn: why am I talking about friendship? Why have I given the paper this title? The answer is quite simply that about 3 years ago, Donati and I wrote a book together called The Relational Subject, in which we committed ourselves to saying, this is the middle paragraph, that friendship is the paradigm of all social relationships because it's free from references to kinship, necessary references, this is. There can be contingent ones, of course. It's free from necessary references to kinship, to sexuality, to ethnicity, to language, to power, status, beliefs, and anything else that you care to put into that pot. And that makes it very general, though not very uniform, because right at the top we have our good friend Aristotle claiming that friendship can be based, well, he has at least 3 categories for it, but there's no need to labor those now, So what today are the main barriers towards considering at least the possibility, because I'm not saying this is something that has arrived, of friendship developing between humans and AI robots? All of them, I would maintain, depend upon attributing deficits to the AI. It's very like post-colonial thinking and all of the deficit qualities that were attributed to colonized people who couldn't do this, were incapable of doing that, etc., etc. In particular, what this plays down are three features of AI beings: capacities, as Nussbaum and Sen would call them, capacities for continuous learning, for error correction, and for adaptation of their own skill set. Now, this comes up against three barriers, which I want to go through in turn. The first one is a normative barrier, which says basically that an AI being is incapable of knowing the difference between right and wrong, and so may harm humans, and hence Asimov's three laws of robotics, dating back to 1942, which were all to protect us against the coming of the robots. Now, there are two responses to this when we come to AI beings. One is the top-down response. It says it's all the responsibility of the designer. He's got to build, she's got to build, safeguarding into the pre-programming stage, and that has to prioritize the safety of humanity. Now, this is in no way a criticism, Christoph, but it was very interesting because I'm sure this is a response to public responses and opinion, that you dealt a great deal with what makes people resistant to automatic cars. And this is what you get in pubs and clubs and so on. And the answer is always to build in safeguarding measures. And some of your responses did just that. There is an alternative, which is the bottom-up method, which takes the child, and child learning as the model, and says, teach them morality. Well, yeah, but sociologically, whose? There is not just one morality out there. Do we want them to be baby utilitarians, or neoliberal economists, or actor network sociologists? What do we want their values to be based upon? It's not an obvious question, and one would hope it would not be solved by interhuman domination. And in fact, I think this normative barrier is vastly exaggerated as an embargo on AI beings moving around in the human world and acting with at least as much goodwill and respect for one another as some people do. And that is, it's another book I've written on the shift towards what I call anormative bureaucratic regulation. In other words, we rely in this morphogenetic, accelerating society more and more not on people's norms and values and normativity, we rely on their cost-benefit analysis. We rely, if you think about irregular parking or speeding in a car, we rely not upon them saying, this is wrong, I shouldn't do it, it's dangerous to others. We rely on them saying, internally, reflexively, is this journey I am about to make, or this visit I am about to make, so important to me that the fine that will be imposed is worth paying? And people do this every day. I'm sure every one of us here has done this at some time or another. So we are just costing more and more things rather than treating them as matters of worth and of consideration. That, of course, means that the robot is probably even better than we are at doing cost-benefit analysis. So I'm going to leave the normative question and go on to the emotional barrier that's supposed to be there. Now, emotions are having a great ride at the moment, completely unwarranted in my theoretical opinion, because my definition of emotions is that they are commentaries on our concerns, and that is at variance with even some of the cognitivists, and I put O'Turney and friends under bullet point 2. Emotions matter. They're the core of human experience, heaven help us. They shape our lives in the profoundest of ways and help us to decide what is worthy of attention. Emotions, as the measuring device for worth, this is, to me, simply unbelievable. Just because a kid screams, I want, in a supermarket, does not mean that the bubble gum is worth having. And so on to much more important examples in human life. And it downplays ontology in favor of epistemology. Now, in traditional social science, emotions always have this aboutness feature. You are emotional about something. That something is real. Humans may fear being dunked in Arctic waters. They're quite right. Ontologically, they would survive for seconds. The one thing that they never express any emotion about, if they're human, is I might rust. Now that's an interesting one for our AI machinery, some of which, or some parts of which, may be very amenable to rusting. So, is it possible for an AI to fear rust? In other words, philosophically, what does the objectively dangerous situation require? Why does it require the addition of emotions? I would argue exactly the opposite way around, that if an AI being is a cognitivist in the broadest possible terms, and thought that X was undesirable, let's say not being able to escape a fire in a theatre or cinema or wherever, because there were only 2 exits and lots of people. Well, the AI, working cognitively without a load of emotional baggage, might avert getting crushed and killed by fighting for the exit, which is usually the effect of huge displays of affectivity, fear, panic, hysteria on the part of human beings. So I stick to my original definition. Emotions are commentaries on our concerns, but they may give us more attention, they may give us more pushing power, as one British philosopher put it, but they don't actually make us more effective, and they're certainly not necessary. This reaches the last redoubt of the emotions, that there is a special feeling, qualia. It's the last redoubt. These are held to have an experience which has qualia attached to it, a unique feel attached to it. It's held to be uniquely human, and thus eternally dividing the human from the non-human, despite the fact that human beings themselves cannot communicate what a qualia is when they have it, if they have it. Anyway, qualia are caught up in epistemology, social epistemology, about their expression. It used to be, perhaps until the end of the Second World War, it used to be very much, and this wasn't just about male soldiers, it was general to the population, in adversity, maintain a stiff upper lip. Don't show that it hurts. Versus the current opposite to that, let it all hang out, tell your narrative, give it voice, etc., etc. So I end up agreeing with you completely that qualia will fade out of our vocabulary as a pre-scientific item before too long, I hope. And so we come to the third big barrier, the barrier of consciousness, which is usually presented as the great abyss. It is a matter which is unique to human beings. AIs cannot think, judge, reflect, or personally in my own books I have abolished introspection and talk about reflexivity, but it doesn't matter so long as we know what we're talking about. So I go back to the historical debate between Auguste Comte and John Stuart Mill, siding with the latter. Comte's objection was that consciousness, you couldn't get hold of it. By the time you tried to grasp it internally, it had vanished and you'd moved on to something else, to put it very, very crudely. Mill's riposte to that was to insert a very brief wedge of time between the original thought that you had or was prompted in you and your inspection of it and response to it. And he derived this from the great American pragmatists, from William James, from Charles Saunders Peirce, and to some extent from George Herbert Mead, who over-socialized it, but never mind. And the basic thought is a very simple one, that we ask ourselves questions and answer them ourselves inside our heads, and this they call the inner conversation. Just to distinguish it, I call it the internal conversation. It makes absolutely no difference. So we are all speakers and listeners to ourselves. That is part of the main part of our consciousness that guides our actions. And being speakers and listeners, we follow the main rule of language, which is turn-taking, in which we alternate between being subject and object in an internal dialogue. Because as William James very cleverly said, our responses do not come pre-clothed in words that satisfy us. So James said, what we do is we welcome some, they just happen to be, first things that come to us happen to be appropriate. Oh dear. We reject others and we reformulate some of them. This is what replaces introspection, but they're getting at the same areas. So if you'd give me 1 minute's indulgence, rather than getting on to where I wanted to get on to, I'll just try and flesh this out for you, but you could do that for yourselves. So you ask yourself a question, could be a completely trivial one. What dress am I going to wear for dinner tonight? Been invited out. I say that to myself as subject. Inserting this little wedge of time, the same self as object says, well, I'm not sure about the blue one. You wore that last time. Have another think. And so that is reflection one, have another think. The subject does and says, well, to itself, all of this is to itself. Does it matter that I wore it last time? And the object self says, it may not matter to you, but you don't want to insult your hosts by making it look as though it doesn't matter. And if we move on to T3, the subject says, well, okay, I don't want to insult them. How about the pink one? And the object self says, come on, you're over 30, stop it. T4, subject agrees, pink is for 15-year-olds. Object agrees, you're so right, go back to the wardrobe. That's the kind of inner conversation that reveals what matters to a person, not to give offense, but to look attractive, and to somehow combine these two things without them being incongruent. Now, unfortunately, I didn't realize how short 20 minutes were, so I'm going to have to stop there, which is just the defense of the AI robot against the main attacks that are launched on it. And what I'm going to have to omit, but maybe it might come up in the questions, is the relational subject, because, just to finish on, so much of writing, philosophical writing on AI beings is talking individualistically. The AI robot has or does not have X, Y, and Z. It's all about one robot. Instead, I want to talk about the dyadic interaction between a human being and a very intelligent AI being, one that's still to come. This too, in a sense, is science fiction. And I want to argue that just as the dyad has different emergent properties from those of an individual, and secondly, that as a dyad we can do all sorts of things together, from physical things like moving a heavy object, to inspirational things like composing and co-editing, co-writing, and that these are perfectly capable of being conducted between these two kinds of entities with some development, with some give and take, with some conditionality, But, to end with philosophy, what's happening in the dyad, the emergent properties that are being generated, they are not imitating. The AI is not imitating the human. This is not an advanced form of Turing test, nor is he trying to con his audience by pretending that he can produce an adequate outcome that passes, like John Searle's Chinese Room, when he doesn't speak a word of Chinese but gives perfect responses in Chinese, given the way the experiment is set up. And therefore, that friendship on the causal criterion is something we must judge from the relational goods that are generated between, in this case, the dyad, but the whole paper goes through the micro level of the dyad, showing that there are relational goods and relational evils there. It goes on to the meso level to show that these can be institutionalized in certain ways, which will be one answer to you, Pierre, about the classroom situation, that these can be honed. What works, you retain. What doesn't work, you reject. And what falls in between, you adapt. And finally, and I know that this has involved several people here, we have the macro level where the EU is contemplating giving citizenship to AI robots, and has already drafted a paper on this and an ethical guide for those engaged in robotic design. I'd just like to put up, just for you to think about, so it's going backwards, what this misses out, because again, it's Asimov revisited. It's how to protect the human being from the things that the Code of Ethics, for example, is put there juridically, in this is in draft form, to ensure that robots are and will remain at the service of humans. It's just a rewrite of Asimov to me. And finally, what's missing in order for robots to have a genuine citizenship? Well, I've just given you a list of things to think about there that aren't actually mentioned in the EU draft, but they will be indispensable for moving around the world and any society. And the most contentious is the last one. And I see we've got no paper, and we had nobody volunteering a paper on this. There is a huge theological problem about, can AI beings be received, I'm using that very generically, into various churches and faith communities? Or will that forever be a fourth embargo which says a machine is not in Imago Dei, therefore it cannot participate? But let's not, give in too early. Let's give the lad a chance. He's shown he can do some remarkable things, so let's not be too robophobic to prevent him doing some even more remarkable things. Thank you.